Okay, we started this morning with our first presentation, which dealt with, if you like, the underlying principles by which you would begin to think about the issue we are talking about. And as we've gone through the day, we've dealt with different aspects, international comparisons, etc. We've just had, obviously, the very, very interesting session on Northern Ireland. But now we're going to move down to the practicalities, or some aspect of practicalities, because I suppose for most of us here in this country, when we think of citizens that have the right to vote in their own elections, we actually probably think of American citizens, because we're well used to the fact that you have even Democrats abroad and Republicans abroad. And what we're going to do here, and we have some assistance from the US Embassy in this, and for which I thank them. We're going to have a presentation from Erin Baumann, who's just completed her doctorate in UCD, and Erin is going to she's a US citizen herself, and she's going to speak to how it's done for the US, within the US system. Erin, please.
All right. Thanks, Tom. Today, I've met most of you before. I'm exchanging my role as facilitator in order to try and take on a bit of the mantle of what it is like to be a US citizen who votes in American elections while living outside the state. Just some background information, I left the US initially in 2007, and much like I think it was the earlier speaker who said she moved to London with the intention of going back in 2 weeks, I was definitely going back within 1 year. And 5 years later, I'm still here, 2 elections, plus congressional elections. I voted in every single election since I left. And I've been able to do so because of the laws that I'll try and review and go through with you guys here today. I'll try and make this as quick as possible so that we can get to any questions if you guys have them. So if you do, feel free to ask me when I finish. So, basic rights. Now, initially, it's set out in the US Constitution that everyone has the right to a vote. But until the middle of the 20th century, there was no real clarification as to when and where US citizens had the right to vote. It was simply said that it was a fundamental right of every citizen to cast a vote. But following World War II, with the rise in the number of specifically uniformed service personnel, so that being diplomats and military personnel, living and serving outside the US borders, questions began to arise as to the ability of non-resident citizens to vote in US elections. Previous to that, there was little to no actual accommodation, there were no structures to allow US citizens to vote from outside the state. So in 1975, following a very active campaign from a number of citizens, specifically living in Germany and across the rest of Europe, which was organized around the revolutionary adage of no taxation without representation, in 1975, the US passed the National Voter Rights Act. Now, in the NVRA, which was updated in 1993, what was said is the top quote here, which is, "The right of citizens in the United States to vote is a fundamental right." Since that was set out, the rights of citizens to vote from outside the state has been updated approximately 4 times. There are now at least 3 different federally structured organizations that are designed specifically to deal with the rights and the abilities and the accommodation of US citizens living outside the US to help them to vote in federal elections. Now, when I say federal elections, sometimes to individuals who don't live in a federal state, this can confuse them. Federal elections refer to presidential elections, Senate elections, and congressional elections. Some states in the US allow US citizens to vote in their state and local elections, but the majority do not. Myself specifically, I live in that lovely district down there. That's where I'm allowed to vote for federal elections. I cannot vote in state and local elections. So, more to the practicalities. How do I actually do this? Getting on the register, every US citizen has to do this no matter where they live. Whether they live inside the country, out, they have to get on the register because registers in the US are controlled at the local as well as the state level. So this means you apply to your local electoral board. It's usually your county board. And for overseas citizens, the Overseas Voter Foundation actually has a very simple form. You go online, click the nice left-hand bar, and it says, find your district. You click your state, click the county you live in, and it tells you a rundown of how you actually apply to get on the register. You can usually, at the same time, also grab the information for how to apply for a ballot. Now, this is one of the things that often confuses U.S. citizens who live outside the U.S. One of the things that you generally find is that citizens will get on the register before they leave, especially if they're kind of study abroad students. They'll register to vote before they leave the country, and then they'll go away, and they'll kind of start wondering where their ballot is. And about 2 weeks beforehand, they'll go, well, I don't have a ballot yet. Why don't I have my ballot? They'll start calling the embassy, wondering what's going on. The reality is they didn't do the second step of the process. They didn't apply for their absentee ballot. If you're on the register, that's great, you can vote. But you have to formally apply to your electoral board and tell them, I am no longer resident inside this district. Whether it is just temporary or it is indefinite, I request that you send me an absentee ballot at said address. Once you do that, it's actually quite straightforward. Getting on the US register is pretty simple. All you have to do is fill out the application and then use either the last 4 digits of your social security number or your driver's license, and you're in. In fact, as most people probably know, you don't actually have to show proof of ID when you vote inside the US. So it's quite simple to get on the register. Getting the ballot is actually quite simple as well, but you have to go and look for it yourself. There is no way that somebody's going to tell you as soon as you leave the country, as you're stepping on the plane, please remember before you decide to move abroad that you actually have to apply to your ballot in order to vote in the next election. That's not the way it works. Individual responsibility in order to cast your individual vote. So what happens when you actually move abroad, you get on the register, and then you get your ballot? In order to cast your vote, you can do it in one of 3 ways. The first is the one that everybody prefers. This is getting your official local electoral board's ballot. Now, I searched desperately for my last ballot, but apparently I threw out my photocopy somewhere between my office moves and my house moves. But for New York State, it's a nice big broad ballot, lists Democratic Party, Republican Party, presidential election, Senate election. They send me the same type of ballot that somebody voting inside New York State would see. They simply send it to me approximately 45 days before the upcoming election. Now, this is something that parliamentary systems would have to deal with, and this is a huge difference between a presidential and a parliamentary system. Presidential system, I know when my next congressional election is. It is the first Tuesday of November 2014. The next presidential election will be the first Tuesday of November 2016. It is always the first Tuesday every second or every 4th year. So it's easy for electoral boards to know what date they have to send the ballots out on. It also makes it easy for them to set a specific date for return. But each state has a separate system for return. Some states only allow you to do it by post. Some states will allow you to do it by post or by fax. Some will allow you to do it by email. Some states require that you have your vote notarized, that you conduct your vote in front of a notary and then you send it in. Approximately 28 states require that you have it notarized. Others will allow you to do it in the privacy of your own home and then just wrap it up in an envelope and send it away. One of the ways that they prevent fraud with this is that it's actually a 3-step process. I receive my ballot, I cast my vote, I fold it up. The next piece of paper I look at is an envelope. I wrap my ballot up in the envelope. The envelope has a little barcode. The barcode is specifically assigned to me and my place on the electoral register in New York State in the 23rd District. So I sign that envelope, and then I put that envelope inside another envelope that has another barcode that is specifically assigned to me, my position in New York State in the 23rd District. I sign that, and then I can either send it off in the post. It's free postage, doesn't matter where in the world you are, it's automatically covered by the US government. Or I can take it to the US Embassy and they can courier deliver it to my electoral board on my behalf. And if I lived in one of the 20 states that allow me to email it, though I don't, or if I lived in the District of Columbia, I could simply email it back through a verification process. One of the things that can happen, though, if you don't receive your ballot, which as somebody with a sometimes less than astute electoral board, it doesn't always arrive on time, or you go looking for it and your ballot just doesn't happen to be there. If you don't receive your official ballot, you can use what's called the FWAB, the Federal Written or Write-in Absentee Ballot. This is an emergency ballot. The reason it's an emergency ballot is because when you grab it, all it says is FWAB at the top, President, Senate, Congress. You need to know who every presidential candidate is and who you want to vote for. You need to know who every single one of your Senate candidates are and which of them you want to vote for. Congressional, the same way, because it's all write-in. There are no candidates listed, no nice, kindly boxes to tick. You have to have all the information yourself on hand. This is one that if you see somebody going to the US Embassy to do all of their voting, this is what they're using. They're using the FWAB. If they're using the official ballot, it's always going to be sent to them either via email or by post. The rumor has been for a long time that if you're an absentee voter, your vote is always counted last and the vote is actually even only opened if there is somehow a tie in the election. That's not true. In no state is that the case. But the way in which absentee votes are counted varies state by state. In the District of Columbia, you can actually send your ballot in up to 10 days after the close of the electoral polls on Election Day. In New York, it's up to 5 days after the close of polls on Election Day. If you want your vote to really count, you need to get it in before Election Day and hope that they open it up in New York State at 7 a.m. on election morning. The earlier you get it in, the more likely it is the vote will actually count. But in some states, it has to be in up to 30 days beforehand. It varies state by state entirely. Now, the next thing I'm going to show you is a quick video. You have to kind of switch over, but this is a video from the Overseas Voter Foundation. This is what explains to US citizens how to do this entire process. So hopefully it'll clarify some things.
Overseas citizen and military absentee voting is a simple, interactive process that you, the voter, can successfully navigate. It gives you a way to participate in U.S. elections, no matter where you are in the world. Some steps you do, some your election official does. At each step, we have tools to help you. Start the process of applying for your ballot by entering your data into the voter registration application. You can save your data in a voter account for future use. Once this form is completed, it will also serve as your absentee ballot request. Indicate how you intend to submit the form. Your state's options may include email, fax, or post. Download the completed form and instructions. Print and sign it. The mailing address of your election office prints with your instructions. Remember, you haven't requested your ballot until you submit your request to your election official, either by post, email, or fax. Even if you transmit your form electronically, you should always follow up by sending the printed, signed original form by post. Your election official needs your original signature on file. Send it off right away. Your election official will process your registration ballot request form and put you on the voter roll. Check the election official directory for contact details and to find the online ballot tracking system for your state. Your ballot will be sent to you either online or by post. Complete your ballot and sign the envelope. This is your vote. Now make sure your vote is counted. Send your ballot back to your election official before the deadline. Congratulations! You're now an overseas absentee voter. Time to get started.
All right, so that's what I generally look at whenever I need to be reminded what I have to do in order to vote. Some of the things that go into this, different states, like I said, have different rules. I can't emphasize that enough. New York is very different than California. Both of them are very different from Texas and from Georgia. In New York, I have to send in my absentee request at minimum 3 months before the forthcoming election. If I don't put that request in, or if I'm not on the registration 3 months beforehand, I don't get that vote. I don't get to vote in the upcoming election. Doesn't matter if I try and use an FWAB. Doesn't matter if I show up to the embassy and beg them. If I'm not on the voter roll 3 months before the election that I want to vote in, I don't get the vote. Have to wait until the next election. So what we need to talk about, everybody talks about the responsibilities this comes with. Taxation is one of the biggest things that often people get into. Now, what the embassy will almost always tell an American citizen is, if I go abroad and I decide to vote, do I suffer tax implications? No is the answer that they'll give you. There is absolutely no implication for your tax liability if you as a U.S. citizen want to vote outside the U.S. However, and there is a big however within this, every U.S. citizen, no matter where you reside, is required to file a tax return with the Internal Revenue Service. So if you make over, as a single individual, if I make over the equivalent of $9,700 in a year, I have to file a tax return. Does that mean I have to pay taxes? No, not necessarily. There's a pretty large exemption rate if you live outside the US and if you earn a foreign income, but I still have to file taxes. I have to be in touch with the IRS and let them know whether I'm earning money from a foreign company, whether I'm earning money on investments. Doesn't matter where I live. The tax system, the IRS, still has to know what I'm doing. So while it doesn't affect your tax situation if you vote in a federal election, that still falls aside of the fact that no matter where you are in the world as a US citizen, the IRS will always manage to find you. They're the most amazing big brother that we have. The NSA has nothing on them. So what are the pros and cons of all of this? I heard people say that they thought that some of the previous presentations were biased, so I tried to find some of the surveys that we've gotten before. Now, as an American citizen, I can say that some of the pros that I find are, it means that there is a truly universal franchise. As a US citizen, I get a US vote. I may not have lived in the 23rd District of New York for the last 6 years, but I have teleconferenced in, this is how nerdy I am, I have teleconferenced in to every major political debate that we have had since then. I have asked questions via teleconference. I'm extremely active in politics at home. I keep interested in it. I'm frankly more interested than my parents or most of my friends. But most citizens who live outside the state, they do start to get a little bit more interested. There is a certain amount of withdrawal, but there is an interest there. And allowing them to vote keeps that connection up. It definitely keeps a sense of connection. You continue to feel like you are a part of the US community. In addition to that, it allows all of the stakeholders' interests to be accounted for. Like I said, I still have to file with the IRS, which means they still know who I am and what I'm doing, which means that I want to be able to have a say in the policies that they put down on top of me. In addition to that, it comes down to simply knowing that you're part of the US as a whole. If I want to return, I'm still able to actually know what I'm returning to and have had a say in that. The cons on the other side are, and these are ones that people will bring up a lot, they say there's a lack of constituency. In some states, you can actually register to vote there even if you have never lived inside the US. So I think Montana is one of them. I'm fairly certain, don't quote me on it, but I'm fairly certain Montana allows it. If you are a citizen by birth, or if you're a citizen simply due to the fact that your parents, one of them at least, is a US citizen. If your parent lived in Montana, you, having spent your entire life living in Ireland, can vote in Montana. People say there's a lack of constituency. You don't know what it's like to live in Montana. You've never been there. You may have never visited, but you can vote there. You can affect their Senate and their congressional elections.
Erin, could you begin to wind up?
There's also swaying of the domestic vote. This is one you guys have heard from Isolt. You've also heard it from others before. The question of fraud also comes up. Usually when there is a challenge, it can almost always fall down on absentee ballots. However, the rate of overturning an election based upon absentee ballot questions is exceptionally low. It's less than 10%. One of the other things that comes up saying that we're not subject to the laws. Am I subject to US law while I live outside the state? No. People say that's a reason that I shouldn't actually have a vote, and it may be a valid reason. Finally, it is a negligible financial burden. Although I still have to file, unless I make over $95,000 in any year, I don't have to pay tax. But that's because the US government assumes I'm paying that tax in the country where I live. So I hope this has answered some of the questions. I know that it's a bit of a complicated system, but I'm more than happy to answer questions if you do have them.
Thank you very much indeed, Erin.